Hello, and welcome to our webinar, How to Succeed with AI Augmentation. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief at Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator. This webinar is sponsored by Five9. For all the remarkable things that machine learning and advanced analytics can do, there are a lot of things that AI-enabled machines still can't do, at least not reliably enough on their own in the real world of business. That doesn't mean you should wait to take advantage of AI. Rather, it means designing AI applications for what people and machines each do best and making sure that they can work well together. In their new book, Working with AI, Real Stories of Human-Machine Collaboration, authors Tom Davenport and Steven M draw lessons from dozens of jobs and work settings in which humans work day to day with AI-enabled systems and automation. Today, they'll talk about why focusing on AI augmentation is the right strategy for right now, the aspects of work that AI can't do yet, what it takes to work successfully with smart machines, and how to engage the right people in the work. Tom Davenport is the President's Distinguished Professor of Information Technology and Management at Babson College. He's also a visiting professor at Said Business School, University of Oxford, and a fellow at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Steven M is Professor Emeritus of Information Systems at Singapore Management University and an advisor to Singapore government agencies and industry on analytics, AI R&D and applications, and manpower development. Welcome, Tom and Steve.
Thanks, Abby. We're happy to be here. Happy to talk about this subject. It's been a topic that both Steve and I have been interested in for quite a while, and we will be discussing it at some length today. I'll start by talking about some of the things that AI is great at, and some of these sort of hint at the need for a human being as well, but certainly in our research, 29 case studies, we found AI is great at taking the first cut at a lot of different things, a diagnosis or a recommendation or some form of content. It's great at operating a machine under what we think of as normal conditions. Normal is sometimes hard to define, and often our lives are characterized by a lot of abnormal conditions, but under expected circumstances, AI is really good at keeping things going. It's quite good at prioritizing human activity, and I think this is not really explored all that much in the AI literature, but a lot of applications that we've discovered, a lot of AI use cases involve prioritizing. I'll talk about some examples in a moment. I've gotten very interested in one of the more boring aspects of AI, but nonetheless quite helpful, which is extracting data from things where it seems to be stuck, a long document, a contract, a database, even an image. You could extract the data that matters, and AI is quite good at that. It's very labor intensive for humans. And then of course the heart of machine learning is predicting the future based on past data. So of course all we have is past data, and so we can create models that fit the past data pretty well, and as long as the past is a good guide to the future, we can do a very good job of predicting, and so on and so on and so on. There are lots of things that AI is quite good at. These are just meant to be a sort of representative sample. We found a number of examples of these in our research. We looked, for example, at a medical coding situation involving the very large company subsidiary of United Health, Optum, where an AI system looks through clinicians' notes and says, this looks like a particular type of surgery, and assigns it a code There are codes, tens of thousands of codes for every medical procedure under the sun, and very difficult for humans to do that on their own without, looking it up or something. And then another example in the healthcare industry, I think one of the most amazing systems out there in the world these days, certainly in that industry, is the Good Doctor system created by Ping An in China. We studied its use in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but over 300 million people are getting a first cut at a diagnosis and treatment from the Good Doctor system. So it's intelligent telemedicine at its most successful, and something that I think we need much more of in the United States. Normal machine operations, we didn't look at a lot of machinery, but we did look at some, and one was from a company called FarmWise based in Silicon Valley. And what they do is automated removal of weeds, cutting of weeds, in some sense to replace the dangerous chemicals that have been used in the past. They're in a lot of lawsuits anyway. I guess there's still some debate about how dangerous they are. But this machine recognizes a weed through deep learning and chops it off at the root without any need for chemicals. And under normal circumstances, it works quite well, although there's a human that walks behind it, and something seems to go wrong moderately frequently in that case, suggesting that things are not always normal. Flippy is a burger flipper. We've known for a while that AI and robots might take the jobs of burger flippers. It hasn't happened yet, but Flippy has appeared in a number of hamburger chains. I did interview one franchisor for a company called Cali Burger, not in California actually, but in Florida. And he said, Flippy is not actually as good as I might have liked at flipping hamburgers, but it is pretty good at pulling baskets of French fries out when they're done. So that's what I use it for. So I suppose that's another degree of abnormality. And while we didn't write about it in the book, I think we are all quite familiar with the idea that autonomous vehicles can drive without a human under normal conditions. However, there don't seem to be enough of those normal conditions for us to really see autonomous vehicles on most of our roads. We do have them under very controlled circumstances in places like Vegas and Phoenix, where it doesn't rain very much and it never snows. But I dread the day that they come to Boston in the middle of the winter. We saw examples of prioritizing human activity in police forces using a tool from a vendor called ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is best known for their gunshot detection systems, but based on that data and some other data, they also do some precision policing, suggesting that if you really want to catch some criminals, you might want to hang out here instead of where you usually hang out. And they can ignore that advice, but in general, it's been pretty effective. There are some issues around the ethics of that. ShotSpotter bends over backwards, I think, to try to do that ethically. And then we also had a case study about a system called Gravity that actually one of my former students was the co-founder of at Babson. And Gravity helps people raise money, and it suggests which donors you should go after, and even will compose emails for you. So, but the prioritization is to say you'll be more successful if you go after this potential donor rather than that one. And it's the same sort of sales propensity modeling that we see in sales forces being applied to philanthropic activity. we had at least one example of extracting data from a long document or database, a law practice in Canada that uses a system called Kira that extracts the important data from contracts. It prevents attorneys from having to read through contracts, and that's apparently another task that's performed in law firms is commercial litigation, where you have to read through, tons of email communications, for example. Humans don't have to do that anymore. They can extract the salient facts from those long documents, and even things like faxes now in healthcare. We can extract data from faxes. One wonders why we're still using faxes in healthcare, but that's another matter, I suppose. And then we had a number of machine learning applications, one at Morgan Stanley that predicts what investment is likely to be appropriate as a kind of a next best action for one of their customers. This is all mediated through their financial advisors. And 84.51 Degrees, one of the more interestingly named companies I've come across, that's the longitude of Cincinnati. And that company, the company with that name, is a wholly owned data science subsidiary of Kroger, the largest grocery chain in the United States. And they do a massive amount of prediction of what offer you will respond to. They actually put out billions of personalized offers every year. They predict out of stocks at every store of every stock keeping unit and so on. So lots and lots of machine learning at that organization. And for the most part, it works pretty well. We saw in COVID at times the path was not a terribly good guide to how much toilet paper people wanted to buy, for example. So there are a number of factors that I've already hinted at why we need humans involved with AI in most cases. The first cut may need some refinement, particularly if you're talking about things like healthcare. A doctor may need to say, well, I'm not sure that's what I would actually recommend. And in fact, in many jurisdictions that are starting to use these intelligent telemedicine systems, China as well as Southeast Asia, a physician actually has to produce the diagnosis and the treatment, or it's not valid. But that does, the AI system does save the doctor a lot of time and effort. As I discussed, many conditions, particularly for machinery, are abnormal, and we don't want, whether we're talking about cars or airplanes or weed cutters, we don't want to suggest that we can eliminate humans altogether. Those things just come up too frequently. Prioritization is a pretty harmless thing to do and often quite useful, but maybe the world has changed. Maybe something about that customer or that philanthropic donor that the system does not know that would bump up the priority for that particular person. I don't have any personal experience of this, but I think it's probably fair to say that sometimes these systems that extract important data don't always get right what data really matters. And as I suggested, certainly during the pandemic, we saw, I published or co-authored a little article on this in Sloan Management Review about, I think it was called Data Science Quarantine, where a number of the companies we talked to were finding that the past was not a terribly good guide to the present. And so they had to develop some new approaches, alternatives to machine learning, to get them through the pandemic successfully. So in our book, as I suggested earlier, we had 29 cases. We had 30, but our editor wasn't that impressed by one of them. So now we have 29 in a variety of settings, a number of financial services, factories, fields, literally fields where crops are grown and so on. And we also, at the end of each case study, we point out the things that we found interesting about the case study, interesting or unexpected. And then we have 7 what we call insights chapters. It takes a lot of people to make these things work, which we found in part because we had to do a lot of interviews to get these case studies done. Everybody's becoming somewhat technical these days, or at least a hybrid business and technical person, it seems. We talk about some technology issues, platforms, and case management systems. Entry-level workers, I think, are at risk. Steve is not as sure, but we both contributed to that chapter that looks at whether entry-level workers are in danger from AI. We talk about the fact that AI enables a lot of remote and independent work, which worked out really well during the pandemic. And then a final chapter called What Machines Can't Do, where we go through a long list of things that, in our observations, machines are not quite capable of. And then we summarize that all by looking into what that means for the future of work. So these are some of the settings. Most of it is information-oriented work, but some manufacturing. I mentioned public safety. We have a case study on ShotSpotter and how that works. We have one public infrastructure case study from Boston, one from Singapore. Sadly, the Singapore machinery is much more sophisticated than the one in Boston, but at least AI is helping in both cases. What we're trying to do is understand this phenomenon of augmentation, and we hear some statistics, official economic statistics about loss of jobs from automation, but augmentation is kind of under the radar from a statistical perspective. So Steve and I were quite confident that the best way to get at that was to use these case studies. And I think it's certainly the most detailed collection of case studies on augmentation that the world has ever seen. One of our major conclusions is it doesn't appear to result in job loss. We didn't see any job loss, even from automation technologies like, Flippy the hamburger flipper, no job loss yet that we could see, and nor in any other cases as well. Couple of observations, and then I'll turn things over to Steve. We saw a lot more instances of augmentation than automation, and we think that's going to continue. I was actually in a debate about this yesterday with Parker Harris, the CTO and co-founder of Salesforce.com. I took a red eye back so I could make it back for this webinar, but at Dreamforce in San Francisco, and he's not so sure that there won't be large-scale automation, but we certainly haven't seen that yet. And AI, we think, is actually better suited to augmentation than it is to large-scale automation, just because it does tasks, not entire jobs. Now, there, may be some cases where that will be different, but that's certainly what we have observed. This is not just the future of work, this collaboration of humans and AI, it is the present. And it's not possible everywhere, but it's happening in a whole variety of settings that you may not even imagine. We don't have to worry so much in the short run about full automation. We say in our concluding chapter, if the singularity comes, all bets are off, but right now it's not an issue. And in fact, many firms can't get enough human employees. Nobody seems to know where they all went, but every country I talk to says we have a shortage of workers now. Part of that is long-term demographics. Part of that is, I guess, people deciding they don't want to work as hard anymore. But we could certainly do with a bit more augmentation and maybe even a bit of automation. We wanted to describe work that is augmented successfully by AI. We only looked at successful examples. We did not make a systematic effort to find out, did you guys have a bunch of failures along the way and elsewhere or whatever? That may be possible, but in general, this is a positive, optimistic look at what happens to jobs and to companies when you augment traditional human labor with artificial intelligence. So with that, I will turn things over to my co-author, Steve Miller.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to pick up on some of Tom's points and elaborate based both on content in the book and even beyond, based on experience we have beyond the book. So first, I just want to make sure that people understand what we mean when we use these familiar terms, automation and augmentation. But from a business and economics point of view, automation means substitution, that enough of the tasks that are part of the job are now done by the tooling or the machine that we displace the human who was previously working. Augmentation, of course, involves automation, but automation of subtasks, so that even with the tooling and with the machine, the human stays in the direct execution loop. And next, it's often easy to think about, well, do we automate versus augment? And after doing the set of cases in the book and just thinking about years of work and ways people are using technology to enhance and improve the efficiency of work, I've come in my own mind to really view it as both. It's automation and augmentation. Well, the world already uses a lot of automation, so that's not going to stop. And where we already use automation, AI-enabled capability will deepen it, and things that we're nearly able to fully automate will sort of move into that realm. So our examples of augmentation don't mean that we're going to stop seeing automation. Of course, we're going to see it and see more of it. But I think the big lesson of our cases is there's more opportunities for augmentation than I think people assume. Let's go to the next slide. So on this slide, I want to direct your attention to the bottom right, where it says there are many examples where with the combination of people and machines, we can attain capability and intelligence levels higher than what can be achieved by only the machine or only the human. Actually, in 29 of our 29 cases, right, Tom, that would be the case, all right? Now, let me just call out a few examples. The company Mandiant, that's a cyber threat analysis. They have a stage of their work called cyber threat attribution. So this is not the real-time defense thing, because a lot of that happens so fast. Of course, you need to use automated tools, but it's like we see these threats on our radar screen. We know they're coming from a cluster. Is this a cluster we're familiar with? Is this a cluster we have a few years of experience with, therefore we can build on that experience, or is it a new cluster? So there's an example where it's impossible for the human to do it alone, but the environment is so varied. And literally every day there's we've never seen this type of thing before. And even if we're seeing it for the first time, we've never seen it before, is only a small percentage of the transactions totally running through the machine, you're still seeing a lot of those cases literally every day. And we had examples like that with DBS Bank, with financial transaction surveillance as well, where the machines played a certain key role, but the nature of financial transaction surveillance is ever evolving because the bad guys and the good guys are in a perennial cat and mouse game. So the analysts, especially for the more sort of complicated, nuanced cases, they have to bring a lot to it above and beyond what the machines can do. All right, and we had other examples like that as well. Let me turn your attention to the left side, and thanks, Tom, for bringing up that. Full automation, it's got to run by itself. So you're limited to what only the machine can do. Now, obviously there are things that have to work really fast, microseconds, milliseconds, right? And that can only be done by automation. And things that have to run at high degrees of precision, or I need to monitor 1,000 or 1,000,000 things at a time. So obviously automation has its place and AI will enhance it. But the key point I want to make is full automation works really well when you're in familiar territories, and even the nature of variance and the nature of unexpected is somewhat familiar. And you can really drive for that efficiency, consistency, and optimization. And under familiar situations, you drive the productivity. So are people going to stop doing that? Of course not. So in a sense, just like we've always used tools and machines to do that, we'll continue to use AI to do that. But what's, I think, underappreciated, because people default to the situation on the left, is the ability to use the tools that we have today. I mean, augmentation obviously goes back thousands of years, right? And everybody who's used a spreadsheet understands the power of augmentation. But the ability to use these AI-enabled tools that can support our ability to do things that we cannot always pre-specify the rules in advance. That's the key of this machine learning, the ability to look at non-routine cognitive-like tasks. And we can use them in new ways. And just like Tom mentioned, people needing to pivot during the pandemic, when the key thing we need is adaptability, when we need a lot of collaboration, when we sort of have to, in a production setting, I don't mean in an R&D setting, invent the path, the path forward. These tools are very well suited for that. Next slide. Next slide. So the default assumption is we think about tools and machines and AI supercharged, enabled tools and machines to drive efficiency, consistency, and optimization. And just like you see on the screen, you see that little blue segment, and sort of metaphorically, it's like, I see how to scale, I see the path from A to B, we just need to drive it. Of course, you'll go the automation route, but your survival for a business, not only just in the last 2 years, but that was just a reminder, depends on the ability to pivot, to change, to adapt, to think of new directions, to do new things. And it's equally important for you to think about using these AI tools for adaptability. Next click, Tom. There we go. And don't just default to, I'm going to use these tools to drive efficiency in the things I'm already familiar with. I mean, you'll do that, but don't underestimate the power for using these tools for experimentation, exploration, adaptability. Tom and I came across a great example at DBS Bank, where both of us ended up doing interviews with a variety of levels of executives. They were a good example of combining this, where they indeed brought automation to some of their information processing and knowledge work, and then redeployed those people. So instead of doing standard transaction tasks, maybe related to some aspect of a call center, I'm now on a production basis, part of the team whose production job is to run experiments, to see how we can run the process better. And other companies do this, of course, but DBS, they had this nice phrase of run the bank, you know, the everyday transaction, versus change the bank, where change wasn't a one-off. Change was a systematized, almost productized, productionized approach for how to do that. And by using automation, they were able to free up headcount to move into the orange, the exploration, and to make that part of the production work. That's win-win for everybody. Next slide. So just a brief thing, you know, I've talked about the regime of familiar efficiency, the regime of when you have to change, adapt. Let me come to the term of intelligence, right? every one of you thinks, oh, AI, I know what AI means. And you forget AI is 2 words. So let's park the artificial for a moment and let's just think about the intelligence word. Most of you, if I pressed you and said, would you define intelligence for me? I'll predict in advance, you'd actually have a hard time doing that, although you would default to say, I know it when I see it, all right? And here we are from Cambridge University, the Handbook of Intelligence, 50 chapters, my goodness, 2 volumes, the ultimate tomb on this topic of the greatest minds in the living world who've, studied this. And I love this statement. Intelligence is the most successful construct in psychology with regards to measurement, but at the same time, it's famous for being impossible to define, right? Because intelligence is not a unidimensional thing. And how many times have you caught yourself saying, oh, I see this new announcement about what some AI-based, probably more likely a machine learning-based system can do. Machines are becoming increasingly intelligent. Next slide. And I just want to remind all of us what we all know. Intelligence has a lot of dimensions to it. Now, there's no one agreed upon framework for intelligence that you can get like the whole scientific community to say that's it, like they will for gravity or something like that. But I like Professor Sternberg, Robert Sternberg's framework for intelligence that he's developed actually over about a 40-year period. And I like this notion of we need to generate novel as well as useful ideas through creative intelligence. We have to ascertain these things and examine and evaluate them through analytic intelligence. Practical intelligence. Just ask yourself in your own work, how much of your time is spent convincing others? You've got the sort of the ironclad analysis, whether it comes from you, your analytics system, machine learning predictions, but you still have to convince other people, act on it and how to act on it. And even if it was successful in another part of your business, how to make it successful in this particular part with a slightly different context, as well as are we in the guide rails? The wisdom, is this, we can do it, but should we do it? Is this the kind of thing I say to my children or grandchildren? Yeah, we found a better way to make money, and it was actually an okay way to go about it. So humans are always cycling across these 4 things, and they're not only doing that, they're always contextualizing, right? Per the situation, per the resources, per the particular needs. Don't underestimate what humans can do. We have our foibles, we have our architectural limitations, we know what our heuristics are that lead to certain biases. And actually the people who build machines, intelligent machines, have come to appreciate the incredible ability of people to do these things in an adaptive manner. So go to the next slide. So, for a lot of us, it's like, hey, well, who's on top? Is it the machines more capable or the people more capable? And you see down towards the bottom of the screen, I have that little yin yang thing, as Tom mentioned. I'm living here in Singapore, so this sort of cultural thing in this part of the world. Opposing forces can coexist forever, and that just sort of be that way. And this notion of, well, when is it that we're going to have the machines exceed the capability of humans? My view is, let's stop looking at it that way. Let's coexist with the fact that, of course, we have super tools. We've always had super tools. We have jet airplanes, we have cars, we have power shovels and cranes. Now we have super tools that can do non-routine cognitive-oriented things, but they can't bring in all the aspects of intelligence that I showed you on that prior slide. They can understand a lot, but understand in a limited way and in a different way. And they make different kinds of mistakes than people make. So we need to get comfortable with coexisting with the fact that AI simultaneously exceeds some aspects of human capability and is inferior. And that's just a situation that's not going to change in the next 5 years. I think will continue for as long as the human race is having these kind of discussions. Next slide. So wrapping up, here are a few suggestions that I have that build on the things that Tom says. You know, when you think of responsible AI, you know, okay, we have the thing with the bias, the fairness, and all that kind of stuff. I'm introducing some different dimensions of responsible AI. As these systems get better and better, interestingly enough, ironically enough, it almost gets harder and harder to know their limitations. You have to pay more attention. So don't be afraid when you put up the business case to talk about the capabilities, but equally important, the limitations. There's a famous, formerly MIT related professor, the guy who created the iRhomba robot, Rodney Brooks. I love his expression that says, anything real has limits. People don't tell you about the limits, it's not real. So as you embrace these increasingly capable systems as part of the business case, understand the limitations. There are ways that we can go in there and we can displace the job, right? But if we do that in a lazy way and just sort of marginally get the justification based on a headcount reduction, and we don't drive productivity, so we don't get what I'll call the productivity induced effects of increasing additional demand. Something you sold for $1, you can sell for 80 cents. And even though you might automate a job, more is going on in that end-to-end value chain. So more jobs get created, right? Don't limit your efforts to just automating the task or the jobs that people are currently doing. It's an obvious starting point because you know those use cases and you're familiar with that kind of work. But if we limited our efforts and aspirations to that, we never get to the future, right? There's many times more people employed now than there were 50, 60 years ago. And a lot of that is because of new work. New types of tasks were created related to new types of jobs and services. So the message I have for you about responsible use of AI is take advantage of augmentation so we can create new ways that go beyond what people what people currently do, and that can go beyond what either the machine or the human can do alone. And as long as we can drive this automation for both productivity as well as adaptability, and do it in a way where we create new tasks, new jobs, and new work, it will be win-win. It's win-win for the business person, and it's win-win for the societies that we have to live in. I'm done, Ton.
Thank you, Steve and Tom. Thank you so much for the presentation. And you raised so many intriguing thoughts along the way. So I wanted to sort of pull on some of those threads, go a little bit deeper. But before we do that, there was a question from the audience, just a sort of a defining thing. And this was asked pretty early in the presentation, so maybe it got answered along the way. But Mark wanted to know, he said, it looks like you're not making much of a distinction between ML and AI. And so I was wondering if you just do a quick definition and in the context of what you're talking about in this book.
Tom?
Well, we don't make a distinction. We view machine learning as a part of AI. It's certainly currently the most popular part of AI right now, but we would also include, natural language processing, not based on machine learning or only partially based on machine learning. We had some examples of rules, the old sort of expert system type of AI that seemed to be still, working fairly effectively. So we view machine and a little bit of robotics. So we view machine learning as a part of the overall, corpus of AI stuff.
Abby, building on what Tom said, last year in March of 2021, there was a brain trust from the United States. They were commissioned to do, it was called the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. These were some very knowledgeable people, right? And some of them as state of the art as you could ever be. But they very importantly said two things. AI is not one single thing. So actually, I wish people would stop saying, we're going to use AI for this, or we need to bring AI into that. Because when you say that, it's a little bit like saying, we're going to use management to solve the business problem, or we're going to use science to address the pandemic. AI is a huge field. Now, other people have done taxonomies where looking across the field, they say there's reasoning, there's planning, there's learning, right? Each of these has gigantic subfields. There's perception and there's communication. And these things intermingle with each other. So if you limit yourself to only ML, you're going to miss a lot of the important action, because it's the integration of the ML, frankly, with all the other areas that's really driving the power today.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions having to do with differences around the world. And Seppo asked, does the study include companies outside the U.S.? And I know that you did, because you talked about some of your cases. So I'm going to build on his question to ask you, what difference did you see across different markets, in particular around this human-machine collaboration? Were there different stumbling blocks that companies encountered? Were there things that organizations had to focus on more, in China, for example, than in the U.S.?
I would say, I'll let Steve talk about Asia, but between the U.S. and Europe, we had, I think, 3 or so cases in Europe and the most in the US and Canada. There was in Europe, I think, more of an orientation to actually having the organization help retrain people than in the US to perform these new kind of AI assisted tasks. And in the US, it was more, figure it out on your own. I've been a little bit disappointed in the role of human resource organizations in really stepping up and helping people adapt to some of these new tools. There is this kind of generic, we need more digital literacy and we'll offer some programs in digital literacy, but that I think is just a very basic level of upskilling.
6 of our cases were Singapore based, or Singapore related to some things directly in the region. Now, Singapore is a very tiny country. Its population total is 3.4 million citizens, about 5.6 million people with the residents and the work pass people. So, but here, labor is in such short supply, and the education programs are very strong. The education programs are very strong, and there's a very strong private sector here, but the government drives initiatives for reskilling and tries to make a variety of programs available. Right? People have to make their choices as to what they do and don't want to do, but the options for getting skilled up as an AI apprentice, for example. There's a national AI initiative that takes people who've got maybe like a few years of work experience, and they'll pay them not a huge salary, but a livable salary to train for a full year to become really strong AI engineers. Now, they only take in 20 to 30 people a cohort, but they've run 200 people through that program, as an example. And DBS is a good example of aggressively investing in the entirety of digital transformation over a decade, huge sums of money. And that created the sort of the infrastructure at all levels, hardware, software, people, process, to move to what Tom so sort of cleverly labels as all in on AI. And they have redeployed their people, you know. I found one example, like the Certus, they do the guard services and the guest services at this amazing mall in the airport and other kinds of malls and facilities. And introducing digital tools like the mobile phone for the 60-year-old person who at that phase in their life, they're doing the guarding work, you know, that kind of thing. Yes, introducing the new technology has been a challenge for some of those people, but it also, this is a combination of the AI with other aspects of digital simplification. It made so many aspects of the job so much easier. It makes it easier for people at that age to continue working. So, you know, a variety of effects, and what can I say? But I can't say for other countries.
Well,
Good question. I don't think we really seriously considered that question until now, but it's a very good one.
I wanted to sort of take it a next step, though, because we were in a piece not long ago on the challenges of implementation, that there's often breakdown at the point of the frontline worker, and those are the people that you're talking about that are, you know, it's the augmentation is the partnership between the AI and the person. And so I'd love to know, as you looked across your 29 companies, did you find companies that that were more successful in addressing that and engaging those frontline workers, not necessarily in training them in the digital part of it or the AI part of it, but engaging them so that they would welcome the help from the AI?
I'll tell you one good example, and I'm sure Steve can think of one as well. Shell has a really big initiative going on that we don't actually cover them in this book, but in another book that I'm working on. They discovered that the whole process of maintaining refineries and pipelines and so on can change as a result of AI. Now, instead of carefully inspecting each inch of the pipeline, for example, we can fly a drone over. We can use AI to take images and analyze the image automatically with deep learning models. And so they had a lot of people who historically did this as engineers, and they decided, well, let's make them experts in AI as well, a sort of a citizen AI corps of maintenance engineers, and they train like 5,000 people already to do this. Now, Shell would probably say that they also are using AI for, you know, sustainability purposes. I think they're farther along on their basic, you know, petroleum-oriented business, but they are doing a great job of retraining workers and engaging them in the new type of work that Steve described.
Abby, I'm going to take your question and take it back to the title of this webinar, which is How to Succeed on Augmentation. And watch this. Tom was the one who, as we were putting together our material, this bit that deployment is a change management initiative. The irony is moving forward with AI is actually very labor intensive. It involves what I have seen, not only from what we did from this book, but from a wide range of other applications where I've had to delve into. I know this sounds a little iconoclastic, but in most cases, there's really doesn't exist an AI application, because there's no business application I have seen where it is solely this little AI algorithm. It does the algorithm and that's it. They're always embedded into, almost always embedded into other aspects of the work process, right?
And other systems as well, right? Platforms and so on. Yeah.
And this is a big change effort, which is good, because what happens in AI efforts, I mean, Tom a lot of people know Tom from decades ago when he was one of the most famous people in the world for process reengineering. And, remember that wave in the 80s? That stuff doesn't go away. Even though the AI methods are new, or some aspects of the deployment are new, the tried and true and the sort of the heavy sweat of changing the way people work doesn't go away. In fact, it intensifies and gets more complex and interesting. And in that way, the way I'm answering your question, Abby, is the firms that don't engage heavily aren't going to succeed. It's almost that simple, right? And if they don't engage on the augmentation, they're going to leave a lot on the table because there's just a lot of things they won't be able to do otherwise. If it's the automation only, it's a much narrower set of possibilities. So I would turn it around and say it's an imperative. If they don't get the engagement and the change management right, they're just not going to move forward.
So Zan has a question that sort of follows on this, which is, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges to speed up the iterative feedback loop from machine to human and vice versa? And I'm thinking about, the slide that you had with the Mobius strip that you're talking about applying something, but you're also looking for those innovation opportunities. So have you seen examples where companies could actually speed that up, and what did they do to make that happen?
Tom, your thoughts?
Sure. Even the Mobius strip was your idea, but well, all I see, Abby, is a lot of companies are saying, we don't want to get too far down the road with implementation and realize that there's not a good fit with the process or the people or whatever. So early on, I was actually listening to an MIT SMR podcast this morning on a pharmaceutical industry company that has, I think after 2 weeks of evaluating a use case, they decide, are we going to take this forward or not? So as opposed to, spending 6 months or a year developing it and then realizing it doesn't work out very well. So companies are doing that. They're creating infrastructure for AI that lets them reuse data, reuse features, feature stores they're called, to speed up that process. I think the upskilling is something that speeds up the adaptation of frontline workers. But I think the creation of this data product role that incorporates ongoing responsibility for not only deployment, but even ongoing management of a AI use case after it's been implemented. I think those are all things that can speed up the process and make it more successful.
Everything Tom said, I have personally witnessed with my eyes on the many successful Singapore public sector AI deployments. And this notion of moving from an ad hoc project approach to it's a pipeline, it's a production process. The reason, will there be companies that just do the automation, try and get the people out and stop there? Yes, they will be that way. They're doing the world a disservice. What I hope we see more of is companies that use automation to get certain grunt work out of the way, to free up headcount that can then be the ones who are not only helping to establish the experimental platforms, but who monitor and work with them on a day-by-day basis. Every business person we meet in any company almost always has the same lament of, we have so much to do and we don't have the headcount to do it. And at the same time, they complain about how much grunt work they have to do that they wish wasn't in their life. So here we have an opportunity to combine automation to sort of free up the headcount for the augmentation so that we can create this new work, do these new kind of things. Now, will everybody approach it with that so-called inspired way? It will take them a while. But if they do that, it's win-win.
Great. So we have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to ask this one from Alberto. His question is, how can, so Tom, at the very beginning, you talked about it takes a village. How can other stakeholders who aren't directly involved in the developing the AI, how can they affect managers' decisions about the design of the AI? What do you see working?
Well, I think optimally, at a very early stage in the process, you'd have the people whose jobs are going to be affected, augmented by the AI, engaged in the process of helping to design it. And you do find now, another thing I like about this data product orientation is that it typically involves a sort of design thinking exercise to say, what are these people looking for in their jobs? What are their management looking for in terms of increased productivity and capability and so on? And to think a lot about that before you charge out and start, developing new algorithms or even gathering data.
Abby, to add on that, for people getting started, the sophistication of the AI method they're using is not the key. In fact, you probably want to stay away from the more sophisticated methods early on until you sort of get your capability built up. The clarity of the use case and finding use cases that have impact but aren't the world's most difficult thing is the key. The only people who know this are exactly that population of people you're doing. And the other thing is we all come to appreciate when we talk to our friends who maybe work as, whatever middle level or lower level jobs they do in the everyday task hierarchy of getting stuff done. There really is very little simple work in the sense that even what we think might be simple work, there's just more variation, more special things. The domains are always super complicated. And these people have to be brought in to explain that. I had one of what I consider one of Singapore's leading deployment senior executives say to me, even in this day of machine learning, if there's no human expertise, you still can't go forward with the application. But it's a different thing. It's not like the old rules-based thing where you needed the person to do the knowledge engineering, right? It's not for that reason. If you don't have the expertise about the problem in the domain, how do you know if the model's any good? How do you get the feedback? So this is your point, and Tom brought it out with the phrase, it takes a village. In every AI project, the model builders and the algorithms and the math types, they're a very small percent of the total employee hours needed to make a better way of working. So the great news is there's ample opportunities for people.
And I guess just to sort of draw a conclusion from what you just said, this has to be really a commitment on the part of the organization from the top to or department. It has to be part of a unit's commitment. It can't just bubble up from a technology organization if it's going to require all of that involvement.
A pilot can bubble up, but pilots won't scale and persist. And Tom made this very insightful point about a data product. With these AI systems, especially the machine learning systems, you cannot deploy and forget. And unless you have that upper management support, that we're going to do all the post-deployment support because stuff happens that we never imagined and behavior emerges that we didn't realize, and new data has come in and the world changes. So that's why people have to be selective about the AI projects because they're not projects, they're products.
Right.
And
Thank
the
you.
implication.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So
right.
Tom and Steve, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your deep research and examples. Can't wait to share the book with other people. And thanks to Five9 for sponsoring this webinar. We appreciate your support.